I've shared a lot with you over the years about my personal experience with the impact of trauma and healing. And there's one aspect that I haven't talked a whole lot about. And I wanted to share with you something that has come up for me at different times, but it's been present pretty recently. That is, I think, an example of how things can come up at different stages in our life. Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you for joining me. I was having a conversation recently with a friend. I was sharing with her something that had been coming up for me occasionally throughout my life, I guess. But in particular, something that came up for me last time I was in Illinois just recently, and what I noticed about it. And she suggested that I share it just to share a little bit more of myself. But she also thought that there may be some value in me sharing it. So I hope so. If you've ever found yourself thinking that something shouldn't be bothering you, or feeling like you haven't done enough healing, otherwise things wouldn't bother you, then I hope that this video just lets you know that you're not alone, and maybe it gives you a little bit of helpful information. So if you've watched many of my videos, you probably have heard me talk about the fact that I grew up in poverty. And while I knew growing up that it affected me, I didn't understand and recognize, actually for a long time, the type of wound, deeper wound that it actually created. I recognize on a day-to-day basis that I felt embarrassed, humiliated, ashamed, but I didn't understand what it was doing to my sense of worthiness, being deserving, being a part of something bigger that mattered. And so I want to talk a little bit kind of about that whole experience. But for me, growing up in poverty, what that looked like is that we moved around a lot. And we moved from the Chicago suburbs to central Illinois, back and forth, several times, many times, up to the age of 10. And then once I was 10, we moved to central Illinois and we stayed there. But we moved so much because we got evicted a lot, because my mom couldn't pay the rent. So we did get some sort of housing assistance. I was young and didn't really know exactly what was going on, but I don't think it was cash necessarily, and we didn't live in like the public housing, so to speak. But I think she got some sort of assistance to help pay for rent. Some, not all. And we also got food stamps. And at that time, food stamps were literally like almost like dollar bills, but they didn't look like dollar bills. They looked like paper, almost like Monopoly money in a sense, but a different design, that were in these little books. And you would tear it out of the book and hand it to the cashier. So I would always feel so humiliated. And I didn't even know what humiliated meant. I didn't know that that's what I was feeling. But I felt it. And I felt this deep sense of shame whenever we would go. And I felt shame for myself and for being somebody whose family used food stamps. And when I say family, I'm talking about really my mom and myself. I was also ashamed of her. I guess because I blamed her for us being in the situation that we were in. And so that was something that I grew up with throughout my time that I was a child. I was 16 when I got pregnant. I moved away to the other side of the country when I was barely 17 years old with a newborn baby, because my husband, we got married when I was 7 months pregnant. He went into active Air Force. So he was away at basic training when I gave birth. When he was done, he came back and we moved to North Carolina. And even during that time in North Carolina, during those early years, actually probably the majority of time, if not the entire time he and I were together, we still were in a really rough place financially, and we did not spend money. We had an old car that his parents gave us that wouldn't start when it rained. We rented a really pretty disgusting apartment that was furnished. It was cockroach infested and termite infested. It was pretty bad, and that was active military. So I think that's a whole other topic of conversation. But growing up and living from that place of not only financial insecurity and not having enough, literally, as a child and then into my young adult life, while I know that it had an impact and it certainly created a lot of stress as an adult or as somebody who had children, I wasn't aware of how much it truly affected me until one day, years later, after we had moved back to Illinois. And I think it was actually when we moved from central Illinois, which is where I ended up going back to and raising my children. After that, we moved up to Chicago again, the area of Chicago, and right near where kind of the area I had grown up in. And I remember driving around where I used to walk a lot as a kid and just having this visceral reaction, this physiological response. And I didn't really know what it was exactly, but I knew that it was associated with growing up there. And I thought it was just like, oh, there's bad memories here. But I realized that it was more than that, because I saw the area is still a lot of, it's pretty impoverished. It hasn't been improved. The structures are not great. So a lot of people living the way that I grew up. And I saw people just kind of like walking around, and I remember having this urge to move away from that. And I didn't fully understand it, and I didn't want to understand it. I wanted to avoid it. I didn't want to feel it because it didn't feel good. It brought up this mild sense of panic and this sense of dread, really. I didn't recognize it as that at first, but that's really kind of what it was, because seeing these people in this area where I grew up, walking around and imagining that they're living their life very much probably like my mom and I did, it just was too close to home, literally. And to the home that I had at the time as a child. And I wanted away from it. I went into avoidance. And I continued to do that. I continued to just be in avoidance for a long time. And what's happened recently, so that would happen a lot of times that I would find myself in like the neighborhood in which I grew up, one of the many, because we moved around a lot. So I lived in, I don't even know how many houses in that area, but or like a school that I went to or something like that. It would come up pretty often, sometimes more intensely than others, probably depending on how vulnerable I was. But this last time that I went back to Illinois, so I raised my kids in central Illinois, and then we moved back up to Chicago afterward, and then we moved to Arizona. But when I go back home to Illinois, I go back to central Illinois because that's where my family was, and now my children have returned there and lived there. And so we've gone back for about a month at a time or so for the last few years. And being back there, it's interesting because I have a lot of good memories there. I raised my kids there, and there's a lot of good memories with that. My husband, my second husband, my current husband, we've been together for 35 years, I think. We have good memories there as well. A lot. of good things happened when we lived there. But I found myself feeling kind of depressed. And the weather was nice, so it wasn't about that, because sometimes I can feel kind of yucky when I'm there because of the weather. But the weather was actually pretty beautiful most of the time that we were there. And I just found myself feeling, I don't know, not necessarily the dread and panic like I was feeling before, at least not generally speaking, but just, I guess, feeling similarly to how I did when I was worried, when I was stressed, when I was a kid even, and having difficulty, because that's where I went to high school. I lived in Central Illinois when I went to high school, and was like middle school age. And there were good things that happened in my life during that time, some, but there were a lot of really not so good things that happened during that time as well. And I think it just created a circumstance in which I was kind of feeling vulnerable. And I also ended up getting sick the second week I was there, and it kind of stuck around the entire time I was there and beyond. But so that creates vulnerability too. So this last time that I was there, so this is the part that if you found yourself in a similar sort of situation, that might be helpful around anything that you're struggling with. This time, I was able to, for whatever reason, I was able to notice some of those feelings coming up and sit with them. I was able to be curious, to wonder from a place of genuine curiosity and interest versus judgment and shame. I was able to reflect back and kind of think about and remember also, but even from my adult place, my therapeutic hat place, able to look back and recognize the significance and the impact of what that means. And we've talked before about how there are so many different things that can affect children growing up. And I've talked about poverty. I talk about chaos. I talk about dysfunction. I talk about things that are happening in your community if you're not feeling safe in your community. Certainly things related to trauma. So from that place of curiosity, recognizing that and acknowledging the truth of what that meant and what that meant for that time in my life when you're separating from your family on an emotional developmental level, when you're trying to figure out who you are and how you fit into the world. That's a challenging enough time for people. When you add on top of it the sexual trauma, the neglect, and the poverty, and of course there are a lot of other things that people experience too. But with all of that, and not having stability in a home, that is impactful. But I did for myself what a lot of people do when they think about things, and I think even sometimes therapists might do this, is that we kind of create this hierarchical sense of what are the predominant things going on. And sometimes there's importance in being able to do that through the therapeutic process. But kind of ranking, in a sense, what is the most significant thing. And in my mind, the most significant thing was sexual trauma. And that's what I focused all of my healing on. And have done, I think, quite well with that. And to me, certainly in the early stages of my healing, and because it wasn't something that really came up very often, it wasn't something I gave a lot of thought to, it seemed kind of secondary. And because I had done so much work and believe in my worthiness and no longer carry shame, it kind of seemed like, okay, that part of my life is healed as well. And recognizing clearly there's still something about that isn't quite healed yet. Because if it was, I wouldn't be having that physiological response in driving through certain areas, because it wasn't about fear. I wasn't concerned about my safety in the moment. I wasn't concerned about anybody in particular. My overall well-being and safety, potentially, just because of everything that means when you don't have a house and you don't have food and stuff like that. But if it's creating that sort of reaction, then obviously there's something there about it. And so from that place of curiosity, sitting with that, exploring it, not analyzing it, and that's an important distinction. Not, okay, if this happens and this is why this happened and this is what needs to happen, and not going through that, but just being with, right? And when I say be with, that's really kind of, it's important to recognize what that means, that it's about kind of, if you think about somebody who's going through something difficult and you just sit with them, maybe you hold their hand, maybe you hug them, but you don't have to say anything, you don't have to do anything, you're just with them in that, versus trying to fix it, figuring out what to do, what needs to happen, trying to get them to tell you what it is that they need from you. Now, there's a place for that, but oftentimes just being with somebody in it is definitely what they need. And I think for most of us, going back to the whole inner child thing, that's what our inner child often needs, is for us in our adult selves to be able to hold space for and be with that pain and that difficulty, the hurt, whatever it is that is there. And so I was able to do that. And that doesn't mean, and this is important, that doesn't mean that magically healed that and that I'm never going to feel any of that again. Because there's a lot of things, as you go through different stages in life, as you get older and you start thinking about retirement and the way that things are right now and all of that, like, things are going to come up again. So I'm certainly not suggesting that fixed it. But just being able to do that, to be with it from a place of curiosity versus judgment, that itself was a healing experience. Even though I don't consciously carry shame around the fact that I grew up on food stamps and assistance, I don't have any shame around that any longer. I did. The fear, the feeling different, feeling undeserving, the fear of not having enough, the fear of what it meant for my future, the fear of being judged, all of that could easily come to the surface again. And a young part of myself, a very young part of myself, and then particularly once I got to about 12 years old or so, and then older, that part carried so much really hurtful shame, like the kinds of things that I would say to myself. So being able to hold space for that, to connect with that, not trying to immediately avoid it. It wasn't necessarily easy. Well, it wasn't easy, but it wasn't necessarily really hard either. But it definitely, there were feelings there. There were some difficult feelings, some difficult memories, some sad memories came back. Some feelings were present. But being able to be with that was healing to all those parts of myself that felt the fear and carried the shame. It was healing to the adult part of myself that has carried the burden of that, who holds fear now about what could potentially happen financially, long into retirement and medical stuff, all of that kind of stuff. And that experience, that process, is an important part of healing, no matter what the wound might be, even, or maybe even especially, when we're not aware of the wound that it really created. And I know right now there's always been people who have struggled financially in all different kinds of all different parts of the world. And I don't understand, I don't know enough about what's happened in other parts of the world to be able to talk about what the actual problem is or anything else. But right now in the US, I know we were, I believe that technically we still are, maybe, although that's probably changing because of our deficit, the wealthiest country in the world. And that has been the case for a very long time. And yet, we have tens of millions of people who can't afford to eat, who have no money to eat. We have parents who are having to choose to feed their child instead of themselves, or having to choose medication over feeding themselves, having to choose feeding their child versus getting their child medication. This never should have been happening in the US. I'm much older now, much older. I shouldn't have had to experience that as a child. No child should ever have to experience that. People that can't work because of a disability or because of age and ailments should never have to worry about food. And yet, this is a country in which there have always been people who have not been able to eat. And right now, there are about to be millions more who will not have food beginning November 1st, or probably already beginning, because that food assistance doesn't necessarily give you enough food for the entire duration until your next payment comes. And that isn't okay. And I know so many people are in so much fear around what that means. And I know that people feel so much shame around being on assistance to begin with. And now to be in a position in which they have to try to figure something else out, they can't figure something out, they're going to be telling their children that there's nothing to make for dinner, and that is not okay. And I think it's important to recognize that the reason that this is happening right now as of November 1 isn't because the US does not have the money. It's because of the decisions that they have made about where that money is going to go. This does not have to be happening. In fact, it didn't have to be happening ever, but because of policy decisions. And this is why, whether you are into politics or not, politics is a part of your life. No matter where you are, even if you're one of those billionaires who makes billions by the day, you're doing that, you're able to do that because of policies that were made. But let's face it, the majority of people, no matter where you are in the world, that's never going to be us. Hopefully, most of you are not worried about being able to put food on the table, but I know many of you are. And that is not a moral failing. That is certainly not a sign or evidence that you are undeserving of having a sense of freedom in your life when it comes to the things that you need. There is nothing to be ashamed of. We live in a very broken world, particularly in the US. We live in a very broken system. And there are so many reasons right now why a lot of people are really struggling financially. And one of the things that makes it so difficult is that finances has a moral, this pseudo moral idea behind it, but it also has a need behind it. We cannot survive without money. And then there's that moral aspect, or this good enough aspect, that if you don't have a certain amount or don't have the right things, then that says something about who you are as a person. And that is just not true. So whatever your struggle has been, whatever is continuing to show up on occasion or often, first know that when there have been wounds, deep wounds that have, even if they don't seem very deep, that have affected your sense of worth, that have made you believe that maybe you're not deserving of good things and you are deserving of bad things, those wounds can stay with you. And they're going to come up at different times for different reasons. So working on, from a place of curiosity, recognizing what those things are. Because when you come from a place of shame, trying to do something to make it better can feel pretty impossible, because you believe that you're not worthy of it or that it's your fault. And I know so many people who are struggling financially kind of get into that cycle, and it can be incredibly challenging, because not only are you judging yourself, this is also true for trauma, but other people are judging you. And I've seen some videos in which, or things written even, where people are kind of mocking people that are on food assistance, and just, it says a lot. It's evidence, right? That is exactly why we are where we are, why people ultimately voted for a rapist, among so many other things. But that's cruelty. And to be okay with people not being able to eat, for children, for the elderly to not be able to eat. It's not okay. And I don't have all the answers, but I do know that if we feel ashamed, we tend to isolate. And what we need in times of real struggle is connection. And so reducing the fear and the shame around struggle of any sort, and right now financial struggle, is so incredibly important. And there are resources out there within your local communities. And I know there's just so much going on right now. But know that you're not alone. And please try to remember, don't isolate. Please do not isolate. That shame and the fear is going to push you towards isolation. It's going to make you want to avoid being around people because you don't want to feel the shame. But that will only reinforce the shame if you isolate. So I'm just thinking about there's so many things creating difficulty for people. And there are things that we can do individually to help ourselves in any given moment, but it's hard when it seems like there's no one in sight. And community and connection is such an important part of being able to get through that. So please make sure, no matter what your situation is right now, stay connected. Whatever that might look like for you, one person, a handful of people, an organization, whatever it is, stay connected. And thank you for being a part of this community. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.